The letter hit the table between them like a gunshot. Gertrude Carver watched Abraham Redmond's jaw tighten, watched the muscle there flex once, twice, as his eyes moved across the paper she had not meant for him to find. The afternoon light came through the window of the ranch house in long golden bars, and the dust motes floating in that light seemed to freeze, as if even the air understood that something irreversible was happening in this room. Gertrude. His voice was low, controlled. The voice of a man who had learned long ago that rage, once unleashed on the open plains, tended to destroy everything in its path. This letter is not yours. She did not deny it. She had run out of denials 3 weeks ago, somewhere on the trail between Kansas City and the Texas Panhandle, and she had told herself it would never come to this. She had told herself she would be gone before anyone looked too closely. "No," she said, "it is not mine. It is signed by a woman named Clara Holt." He set the paper down. His hands were very still. "Clara Holt, who answered my advertisement in the Missouri Gazette for a woman of good character and practical skill willing to come west and manage a ranch household." He looked up at her then, and the dark intensity in his brown eyes was worse than anger. It was something closer to grief. "You are not Clara Holt." "I am not." "You borrowed this coat." He nodded at the deep green wool coat she wore, the one she had not taken off since arriving in Tascosa because it was the only decent garment she owned, the one that still smelled faintly of another woman's lavender water. "And you forged her letter of acceptance." The word forged hung in the room like smoke. "I used her name," Gertrude said carefully. "I wrote the letter of acceptance in her name, yes." "Why?" It was such a simple question. It deserved a simple answer, and she did not have one, because the truth was layered and complicated and reached back through 3 years of a hidden past she had been desperately running from since the moment she stepped off a train in St. Louis with nothing but a borrowed identity and a stolen hope. The truth was she had seen that advertisement in the Gazette not because she was looking for a husband or a household to manage, but because she was looking for the furthest possible distance between herself and the life she was fleeing. The truth involved a man in Philadelphia named Harlan Voss, and a secret she had kept buried so long it had grown roots, and a dark past that had a way of catching up to people no matter how many miles of prairie they put between themselves and it. "Because I was desperate," she said at last, "and because Clara Holt was not coming." Something shifted in his expression, not softness exactly, but a crack in the granite. "How do you know she was not coming?" "Because I saw her board a westbound train in Kansas City with a different man and a wedding ring on her finger," Gertrude said. "She had already made her choice, Abraham. She was never going to arrive. Your ranch would have sat waiting for a woman who had already decided on a different life." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, she could hear the hands moving around the yard, could hear the sound of a horse being shod, the rhythmic ring of hammer on iron, and that sound felt like a heartbeat, steady and inevitable, marking time in a moment that could go either way. "That does not explain," he said slowly, "why you did not simply tell me the truth when you arrived." "No," she agreed. "It does not." He pushed back from the table. He stood, and he was tall, taller than she remembered noticing in the confusion of arrival, when she had climbed off the stage in Tascosa with her heart hammering and her borrowed coat clutched around her shoulders, and had looked up to find a man with sun-dark skin and watchful eyes waiting with a sign that said Holt. She had walked to him. She had let him call her by that name for 3 weeks. She had cooked his meals and mended his fences and learned the rhythms of his land. And somewhere in those 3 weeks she had stopped being afraid of him specifically and started being afraid of something else entirely, something warmer and more dangerous than fear. He walked to the window. He looked out at the land. "You need to tell me who you are," he said. "The real answer." And so, with the afternoon light going amber and the sound of iron on iron marking time outside, Gertrude Carver told Abraham Redmond everything. It had started in Philadelphia in the spring of 1878. Gertrude had been 24 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher father who had died of consumption and a mother who had remarried badly. Her stepfather, Harlan Voss, was a man who wore respectability the way some men wore their Sunday coats, only on the days it served him. He dealt in land speculation, in forged deeds, in the kind of quiet corruption that left no fingerprints because it wore a good suit and shook the right hands at the right dinners. Gertrude had understood this about him long before her mother had, and understanding it had made her a liability. When she had discovered the ledger, the real ledger hidden behind the false back panel of his study desk, the one that detailed the fraudulent transfer of deed rights on 11 parcels of Pennsylvania farmland, she had made a mistake. She had confronted him. Harlan Voss was not a violent man. He was something more dangerous. He was a methodical one. Within a week of that confrontation, he had begun the careful work of dismantling her reputation. A word here, a suggestion there. Miss Carver is troubled. Miss Carver has episodes. Miss Carver made a most disturbing accusation against her own family. By the time she understood what he was doing, the machinery was already in motion. There was talk of an institution. There was talk of her mental unsoundness being a danger to herself. She had run. She had taken what money she could find, and she had run to her mother's sister in St. Louis, an aunt who received her with uncomfortable pity and housed her in a spare room and whispered that perhaps it would be best if Gertrude moved on before Harlan's people came looking, because they would come looking. A woman who had seen that ledger was a woman who had seen a great deal too much. In St. Louis, she had met Clara Holt. Clara was everything Gertrude was not in that moment. She was settled. She was calm. She was a woman who had made a sensible plan. She had answered an advertisement from a rancher in the Texas Panhandle. She said, a man named Abraham Redmond who needed a capable woman to help run his household. She had corresponded with him for 2 months. She had agreed to come. And then, at the very last moment, she had fallen desperately in love with a riverboat merchant named Thomas Holt, whom she had married in a ceremony Gertrude witnessed, and she had boarded a train heading east, not west, with a look on her face like a woman who had finally found the thing she had been searching for all along. She had left her letters on the table of the boarding house kitchen, including the letter of acceptance to Abraham Redmond. Gertrude had stared at those letters for 2 days. She had thought about Harlan Voss. She had thought about the institution. She had thought about the look on her mother's face that last night in Philadelphia, the careful blankness of a woman who had made a terrible choice and could not unmake it. And she had picked up Clara Holt's pen and she had written a letter of acceptance, signing Clara's name, and she had gone west. She told Abraham all of this. She left nothing out. Not the ledger, not the institution, not the borrowed coat that Clara had left behind along with her letters and her plans, not the way Gertrude had worn it through 3 states like a second skin, like armor, like a lie she was trying to make true by wearing it long enough. When she finished, the room was quiet. Abraham turned from the window. Harlan Voss, he said, he is still in Philadelphia, as far as I know. And you believe he would follow you here? She had been trying not to think about this. I believe he would send someone if he thought the ledger information could still reach the wrong ears. She paused, or the right ears depending on how you look at it. Abraham studied her with those dark, watchful eyes. She had noticed his eyes early on. They were the eyes of a man who had learned to read landscapes and weather and people with the same unhurried attention, the same patience that was not coldness, but rather a kind of deep steadiness, the kind that came from years alone on land that did not coddle you. He was 31 years old. She knew this because she had asked, because the loneliness of his house had surprised her when she arrived, and she had been trying to understand him. He had come west from Virginia at 22, had worked as a cattle driver, had saved his wages with ferocious discipline, had bought this land in Oldham County in 1874, and had been building it alone ever since. He had 3 full-time hands and seasonal workers during drive season. The house was well built and underfurnished, the way houses built by solitary men tended to be. She had, in 3 weeks, done things with that house. She was not thinking about that now. I should leave, she said. I recognize that. I came here under false pretenses. I lied to you by omission for 3 weeks, and you deserve better than that, and I will go." "Where?" he asked. It was such a simple question that it stopped her completely. "I do not know," she admitted. Abraham Redmond was quiet for another long moment. Then he picked up the forged letter from the table. He folded it carefully. He crossed to the fireplace and he held it to the small flame that was burning there against the October chill, and he held it until it caught, and he held it until it was ash. "Your name is Gertrude Carver," he said, watching the paper burn. "Yes. And you can cook, and you can mend, and you can manage an account book, and you can keep a ranch household running with a competence I have not seen since my mother ran her family's farm in Virginia." She was not sure what to say to that. He dropped the ash into the fireplace. He turned to look at her. "Then I suggest," he said, "that we renegotiate your arrangement here, starting with the truth." She had expected anger. She had expected him to put her on the next stage back to wherever and let her face what was waiting for her. She had not expected this careful, pragmatic grace, this willingness to simply begin again on honest ground. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you keep me knowing what I did?" He was quiet for a moment in a way that felt like he was measuring words before he spent them. "Because," he said at last, "Clara Holt was never going to come, and you came anyway. And that took a courage I am not prepared to dismiss." The Texas Panhandle in October 1879 was a place of extraordinary and merciless beauty. The sky was enormous, genuinely enormous in a way that people who had only seen eastern skies could not fully anticipate, and it sat over the land like a vast blue weight that somehow felt like freedom rather than pressure. The grass had gone golden with the turning season. The Canadian River cut through the draw to the east of Abraham's land and made a sound in the early morning that was the loneliest and most beautiful sound Gertrude had ever heard. She learned the land the way she had learned everything in her life, which was through relentless attention and the refusal to pretend she understood something she did not. She asked Abraham questions. He answered them. The dynamic between them shifted in the days after the confrontation with the letter, became something more direct, less careful, like two people who had been speaking through a curtain and had finally agreed to take it down. He told her about the cattle, about the brands, about the seasonal rhythms of the drive. She told him about the ledger, about the details she had memorized because she had understood even then that memory might be the only currency she would have. He listened to her describe Harlan Voss's fraud with the kind of focused attention she had never experienced from a man before, the kind that said, "Your words matter, and I am going to hold them carefully." His 3 hands were named Domingo, Pete, and a man everyone called Cutter for reasons no one had explained to her yet. Domingo was from a Mexican family who had been ranching in the Panhandle before Texas was Texas, and he had an ease on horseback that made everything he did on a horse look like conversation. Pete was a former Union soldier from Ohio who had come west after the war with nothing but a bad knee and a determination to start over. Cutter had one glass eye and an encyclopedic knowledge of cattle that he dispensed in short sentences and never seemed to require gratitude for. They had been cautiously polite to her in the weeks when she was Clara Holt. In the days after she became openly Gertrude Carver, something changed in how they treated her. She suspected Abraham had spoken to them, but she did not ask about it. They became, not warm exactly, but genuine. Domingo began teaching her Spanish words for the plants on the land. Pete fixed the kitchen pump without being asked. Cutter told her, unprompted, that the reasons they called him Cutter involved a knife-throwing contest in Dodge City that he had both won and also lost in a way that required some explanation, and the story he told made her laugh so hard she had to sit down. She had not laughed like that in a very long time. The surprise of it felt like something breaking open in her chest in the best possible way. Abraham watched her laugh. She caught him watching. He looked away. She filed this fact carefully. 3 weeks after the confrontation with the letter, they were at the kitchen table after supper. Gertrude working through the ranch's account books, which Abraham had handed over to her with a kind of relieved exhaustion that told her numbers were not his natural territory, and Abraham reading a month-old newspaper from Amarillo that had arrived with the supply wagon that day. The lamp was between them. The wind was doing something architectural outside, building and tearing down invisible structures against the walls of the house. "There is an error in your feed account from August," she said. "I know," he said without looking up. "You overpaid Connolly's by $6. I know that too. Have you collected it? I was going to get around to it." She looked at him. He was still reading the paper, but the corner of his mouth had moved in a way she was beginning to catalog as his version of amusement. "You were not going to get around to it," she said. "Probably not. Abraham." He set the paper down. The use of his name by her, without title, had been something that developed slowly and naturally over the weeks, like a path worn by habitual crossing. "Connolly knows I will not chase him for $6. He exploits that. Then I will go to town and collect it." Would go to Tascosa to argue with a feed merchant over $6. "I would go to Tascosa to establish that this ranch does not absorb losses through inattention," she said. $6 this month, 12 next month, and by spring you are owed $40 that you will never see." He studied her with those patient eyes. "You would be good at running things," he said, and there was no flattery in it, only observation. It landed differently because of that. "I am good at running things," she said simply. "I have had to be." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Tell me about your mother." The question was unexpected. It moved through her like cold water. "She was a gentle woman," Gertrude said carefully. "She had the misfortune of being gentle in circumstances that required something harder, and she chose Voss over you. She chose the life he provided over the discomfort of believing me." She kept her voice even. "That is a different thing, a smaller thing in some ways. It is a choice made from fear rather than malice. It does not feel smaller." "No," she admitted. "It does not feel smaller." He nodded, as if she had confirmed something he had already known, and picked his paper back up. And somehow that was more comforting than anything more elaborate could have been. She went to Tascosa the following morning in the buckboard with Domingo, and she collected the $6 from Connolly's with a politeness so precise and implacable that Connolly paid her, with an expression of profound respect and only moderate resentment. On the way back, Domingo told her, with the careful casualness of a man delivering important intelligence, that Abraham Redmond had been the subject of 4 separate matrimonial advertisements over 3 years, and that every previous arrangement had fallen apart before arrival, and that the hands had begun to believe the boss was simply constitutionally unable to let a woman get close enough to matter. "And now?" she asked. Domingo shrugged. "Now we think maybe the right one needed to come in a borrowed coat." She told herself this meant nothing. She told herself this on the ride back, and in the kitchen while she made supper, and in the dark of her room that night while the wind built its invisible structures outside, and she lay awake thinking about a man who had burned a letter that could have ended everything and had started over instead. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday in early November. Gertrude was in the yard, hanging the week's washing on the line strung between 2 posts near the barn, when the rider came up the south road. She noticed him because the horses noticed him, the way horses notice something wrong before humans do, their heads coming up and their ears going forward. The rider was not from around here. His horse was too well groomed and too tired in the wrong way, a horse that had been ridden fast over long distances, not a range animal. And the man riding it had the look of a city man trying to wear the West like a costume, the hat too new, the coat too heavy for the climate, the eyes moving over the property with an acquisitive calculation that made her stomach drop. She knew the type. She had grown up around men like this. Harlan Voss employed men like this. She took the washing off the line. She walked calmly into the house. She shut the door and stood with her back against it for a moment, breathing. Abraham was in the north pasture. She did not have time to get to him before the rider reached the yard. She went to Abraham's study. She stood in front of his gun cabinet for a moment, then made a decision. She took the Colt revolver from the cabinet, checked that it was loaded, because she had been raised practical and had learned to shoot on her uncle's farm in Pennsylvania when she was 15, and she put it in the pocket of her apron with the grip accessible. Then she went back to the front room and opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The rider had dismounted. He was standing in the yard, holding his horse's reins, looking around with that acquisitive look. "Can I help you?" she called. He looked at her. Something went through his eyes that she did not like. Recognition, or almost recognition, the look of a man comparing a description to a reality. "I am looking for the Redmond place," he said. "You found it. Is the owner about?" "He will be directly," she said. "What is your business?" "Personal matter." He was still looking at her with that assessing look. "My employer has an interest in locating a woman who may have passed through this region, a Miss Gertrude Carver from Philadelphia." Her heart was a fist knocking against her sternum. She kept her face completely still. "I am not aware of anyone by that name," she said. "I am the ranch housekeeper and I have not been in this position long. If you leave your employer's name, I will be sure to pass it along when the owner returns." "My employer is a gentleman named Harlan Voss," the man said, watching her face. "Perhaps you have heard the name." "I have not," she said. He smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "He said to tell whoever I found here that he is simply concerned for his stepdaughter's welfare, that she left Philadelphia under difficult circumstances, that he would very much like to see her home safe." "That is kind of him," Gertrude said. "I will be sure to mention it." She heard footsteps behind her. She heard the particular sound of Abraham's boots on the porch boards, and the relief was so sharp it was almost painful. "Who is this?" Abraham said. He had come from around the house, not from the north road. He had, she realized, already seen the rider from the pasture and come in from the side. "A visitor," she said. "Looking for someone." She looked at Abraham steadily, willing him to understand. "I told him I was not familiar with the name he mentioned." Abraham looked at the man in the yard. He stood beside her on the porch, close enough that their arms were almost touching, and something about the way he positioned himself there between her and the rider made something warm and fierce unwind in her chest. "What's the name?" Abraham asked. "Gertrude Carver," the man said. "Never heard it," Abraham said without a flicker of hesitation. "My housekeeper's name is Clara Redmond. She is my cousin's widow, come to help manage the household. You are on private land, friend. I would appreciate you heading back toward town." The rider looked between them. He was reading something in the way they stood together. She could see him reading it, and she could also see him deciding whether to push it and concluding he did not have enough certainty to push it. He nodded once, a tight, unsatisfied nod. "I will let Mr. Voss know," he said. "You do that," Abraham said pleasantly. They stood on the porch and watched him ride south. They stood there until the dust of his horse had settled and there was nothing on the south road but the road itself, empty and ordinary in the afternoon light. "Clara Redmond," she said. "It was the first thing that came to mind," he said. Then, after a pause, "Are you all right?" She reached into her apron pocket and produced the Colt. She held it out to him, grip first. "I borrowed this as well," she said, in a less forged sense. He looked at the gun, he looked at her. "You know how to use that." "I know how to use that." He was quiet for a beat. Then something in his face shifted in that way she was beginning to love, that slight softening that was the closest he came to open warmth, and he said, "He will send someone else, or come himself." "I know." "Tell me about the ledger," he said. "Everything you remember," she told him. They sat at the kitchen table in the late afternoon, and she told him everything she had memorized from those pages. Every name, every parcel number, every date, every sum. She had an excellent memory. Her father had given her that. He had been a man who believed that a woman's mind was not a lesser instrument, and he had trained hers accordingly, and she had spent 3 years keeping those details locked behind her eyes like a secret room. Now she opened the door and handed everything to Abraham, who wrote it all down in his careful, economical handwriting. "There is a man in Amarillo," Abraham said when she finished. "United States Marshal named Briggs. He worked the cattle fraud investigations in 1876 and 1877. He is the kind of man who would be interested in this. You know him. I know of him. Domingo knows him better. His brother worked on one of Briggs's investigations. He looked at what he had written. This is enough. This is more than enough, Gertrude. What you are carrying in your head would be enough to end Voss completely if it reached the right federal ears." She had not let herself think of it that way. For 3 years she had thought of what she knew as a burden, as the reason she was running, and not once had she allowed herself to think of it as a weapon. The reframing of it sat strangely in her mind, then began to settle. "You would do that," she said. "Contact Marshal Briggs for me." "For you and because land fraud hurts people," Abraham said. "There are families in Pennsylvania living on land they think they own. 11 families, you said, who know nothing of forged deeds." She looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them again because it was always the lamp between them, the warm, ordinary center of their evenings. She was aware suddenly of a feeling she had been trying to file under gratitude and keep there, a feeling that had grown too large for that container and was now pressing against its edges in ways she could not pretend were simple. "Abraham," she said. "Yes." "Why are you doing this?" He set his pen down. He looked at her for a long moment with those careful watching eyes, and she felt the weight of his attention the way you feel the weight of weather, something that covers you and changes everything about your experience of a moment. "Because," he said slowly, "you came to a strange land wearing a coat that was not yours, carrying a name that was not yours, running from something that should never have been put on you. And in 3 weeks on this land you have made it feel more like a home than it has felt in 5 years. He stopped, started again. "And because I do not think you are a woman who frightens easily, but you were frightened when that rider came, and the fact that you stood on that porch and faced him anyway is something I find it very hard not to." He stopped again. The lamp burned between them. The wind was quiet outside for once. "Very hard not to what?" she asked, and her voice was quieter than she intended. He held her gaze. "Admire," he said at last. The word was careful and deliberate and held more weight than it technically contained. She did not look away. Neither did he. "I see," she said. "Do you?" "I am beginning to," she said. Domingo rode to Amarillo the following week with a sealed letter from Abraham to Marshal Briggs, containing everything Gertrude had recalled from the ledger, written in her own hand and signed with her true name. It was the most frightening thing she had done since walking up to Abraham's sign at the Tascosa stage station and letting him call her Clara. Signing her real name to a document that would travel to a federal marshal, while a man named Harlan Voss had people looking for her, was an act of either tremendous courage or considerable foolishness, and she had not yet fully determined which. While they waited, they worked. The work of a ranch in November in the Panhandle was constant and physical and profoundly clarifying. There was the daily maintenance of the animals, the horses and the handful of cattle kept close to winter. There was the cellar to be stocked against cold months, the preserves, the smoked meats, the stores of flour and cornmeal and dried beans. There was the endless repair work that a building exposed to panhandle wind required, the chinking of cracks, the replacing of damaged boards, the weatherproofing of doors and windows against the blue northers that came down from the plains without warning and dropped the temperature 30 degrees in an hour. She worked alongside the hands and alongside Abraham with an energy that she recognized as joy, an uncomplicated physical joy she had never associated with labor before because the labor she had done in Philadelphia had always been performed under the weight of social performance, of being watched and judged and measured. Here there was no watching except the sky, and the sky, for all its enormity, was not judgmental. Abraham taught her to ride properly. She had been on horses, but Eastern riding, the controlled and formal kind, was not the same as the fast and practical horsemanship required on open land. He took her out on a calm bay mare named Jessamine, and he walked beside her on his own horse for the first several lessons, watching her seat and her hands with the same focused attention he brought to everything, offering corrections in a direct and unembarrassed way that she found she could receive without defensiveness because they came from genuine care about her learning. On the third lesson, she asked him to show her how to run. He looked at her. "I want to know what it feels like," she said. "Running without anything chasing you." He understood this. She saw him understand it. "Follow me," he said. "Do not pull the reins, just shift your weight back slightly if you want to slow. She will listen to your body." He gave his horse a signal she did not catch, and suddenly they were moving, not a canter but a genuine run, the kind that ate distance and made the earth a blur below, and the sky a vast streaming blue above. And Jessamine ran beside Abraham's horse with an understanding that transcended instruction. And Gertrude Carver ran across the open Texas Panhandle on a November afternoon with her hair coming loose from its pins, and her heart doing something she had no adequate word for. When they slowed, she was laughing. Abraham was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something open and unguarded that he appeared to realize a moment after she did, and that he quickly folded back into his usual steadiness. But she had seen it. She had the image of it locked behind her eyes the way she had locked the ledger numbers, permanent and precise. She filed this fact very carefully. On a Thursday afternoon in late November, a reply came from Amarillo. Marshal Briggs was interested, very interested. He had, it turned out, received previous information about Harlan Voss from a different source, a former business partner who had broken with Voss in 1877 and had provided testimony that was useful but incomplete. What Gertrude had provided in her letter, the specific parcel numbers and deed references and the dates of the fraudulent transfers, was the missing material that completed the picture. He was writing to Washington. He also wrote that Voss had engaged a private inquiry agent named Garrett Fitch, based in Kansas City, to locate a person he described as a troubled young woman who had absconded with sensitive family documents. He cautioned that Fitch was experienced and persistent, and that if he tracked her to Tascosa, the situation could become complicated before federal action caught up. Abraham read the letter. He read it twice. Then he handed it to Gertrude. She read the words "troubled young woman" and felt a white-hot anger that was cleaner and more clarifying than anything she had felt in 3 years. "He is still using that," she said. "Yes. The narrative that I am unwell, that I invented the fraud. Yes." Abraham folded the letter. But Briggs is not convinced of it. His letter is not the letter of a man who thinks he is dealing with an unstable woman making accusations. His letter is the letter of a man who has been given a key that fits a lock he has been looking at for 2 years. She set the letter down. She pressed her hands flat on the table, palms down, feeling the solid grain of the wood. "Garrett Fitch," she said. "We are going to handle this," Abraham said. "Abraham, I'm not saying it to reassure you," he said. "I am saying it because it is true and because I intend to make it true. Briggs is moving. The federal process is moving. What we need is to manage the time between now and when it catches Voss. That means making sure Fitch cannot walk onto this land and take you somewhere before federal action completes." He paused. "The simplest way to make that impossible, legally speaking," she looked at him, he looked at her, "is for you to have a different legal status on this land than a housekeeper does." The word he did not say was wife. It sat in the room between them like a physical thing. She was aware of her own heartbeat. "That is a significant solution to a practical problem," she said carefully. "It is," he agreed. "I am aware of that. And I want to say clearly," she continued, "that if that is the reason—" "It is not the only reason," he said. "I would not insult you by pretending it is." She looked at him across the table. Outside, the wind had picked up and the dry grass was bending in long waves toward the east, and the sky was doing something complicated with the last light of the afternoon, pulling it into shades of orange and deep rose that seemed almost too large to be real. "Then tell me the other reasons," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You came here with nothing but a borrowed coat and a name that was not yours, and in 7 weeks you have made this house feel like something worth coming home to. You stand on porches with guns in your apron pocket and face men that frighten you, and you do not let the fear control your face. You get $6 back from a feed merchant through sheer force of precision. You run horses on the open plain and you laugh like someone who forgot they were allowed to. She was very still. I have placed 4 advertisements over 3 years, he said. Every arrangement ended before it began. I was beginning to believe I had made an error in the specific shape of what I was looking for. He held her gaze with that steady, deep attention. And then someone showed up in a borrowed coat and a borrowed name and turned out to be the exact shape I had not known I was looking for. The lamp, the wind, the enormous fading sky through the window. Abraham Redmond, she said softly. Gertrude Carver. You should know, she said, that I am 32 years old and I have a dark past and a forged letter on record and a federal investigation attached to my name and a private inquiry agent potentially on his way to Tascosa. I know all of that, he said. You should also know, she said, and her voice was doing something she could not entirely control, that I have not felt safe in 3 years. Not once. Not until I was sitting at this table at night with a lamp between us, and account books and a man who burns letters in fireplaces and calls me by my real name. He came around the table. He stood before her and he was close, closer than the usual distance of their work-together life, and his hand came up and he touched her face with such careful, deliberate gentleness, just the tips of his fingers against her cheek, and she realized she was shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the release of 3 years of something that had been wound too tight. "Will you marry me, Gertrude?" he asked. "With full knowledge of everything you just told me, and with the understanding that I intend to stand between you and every piece of your dark past until it is resolved, and then after that for as long as you will let me." She covered his hand with hers against her cheek. "Yes," she said. "With full knowledge of everything you just told me, and with the understanding that I am an equal partner in the standing." He smiled. The full version of the smile that she had only seen in pieces, and the whole of it was remarkable, warm and real and slightly undone. The smile of a man who had not been sure this was coming and was genuinely staggered by the fact that it had. He kissed her. It was gentle and deliberate, and it lasted a long time. There in the kitchen with the lamp burning and the wind outside doing its endless architectural work. And when they separated, she was aware of something settling in her chest like a foundation stone being set, solid and permanent. "We should tell Domingo," she said, "before he hears it some other way." Abraham laughed, the full version of that too. "He will be insufferably pleased with himself," he said. "Good, he has earned it." They were married in December, 3 weeks later, by the Justice of the Peace in Tascosa. It was a small ceremony which Gertrude had expected and which suited her. Domingo and Pete and Cutter attended, along with 2 neighboring ranchers' wives who had called on her in November, and whom she had come to like enormously. A Mrs. Elara Garfield who ran her husband's land accounts with the same implacable precision Gertrude brought to Abraham's, and a Mrs. Josephine Catt who had been born in New Mexico and spoke with a directness that Gertrude found deeply refreshing. She wore a dress she had bought in Tascosa, a deep blue wool, not borrowed, entirely hers. She had sold the green coat to a woman at the dry goods store who had admired it, and she had used the money to buy herself gloves that fit properly. The letting go of the coat had felt like more than it technically was, like the closing of a door on a particular kind of survival. Abraham wore a dark suit that made him look somewhat formally uncomfortable in the way of men unused to formal clothing, and he held her hand through the entire proceedings with a grip that was firm and constant. "I do," she said when the moment came, and she meant it with every scrap of herself. "I do," he said, looking at her, not at the justice of the peace. Domingo was, as predicted, insufferably pleased. The days that followed were the happiest she had known in years, possibly the happiest she had known without qualification. The ranch in winter had a quality of closeness that the open months did not, the shortened days and the cold drawing everything inward, the hands spending more time near the stove in the evenings, the horses close in their barn, the household gathered and warm against the blue northers that came howling down from the plains with their sudden fury. She and Abraham found the rhythms of a shared life with a naturalness that surprised her. She had feared there would be awkwardness, the adjustments of two people who had been separately alone coming into close daily proximity. Instead, they seemed to fit together with an ease that felt not like luck, but like the specific compatibility of two people who had learned hard things about the world and had come to a similar set of conclusions. He was not a man who filled silence for the sake of filling it, and neither was she. They could sit for hours in the same room, reading or working, the comfortable quiet of two people who did not need performance from each other. And then they would talk, and the talking was easy and real and ranged widely across everything: the land, books, the history of things, memories carefully and then less carefully shared. He told her about Virginia, about a mother who had been the strongest person he had ever known, who had managed a farm during the worst years of the war with two small children and no husband present. Because his father had gone to fight for reasons Abraham had never fully made peace with, and had not come back for different reasons that Abraham had even less peace with. He told her this without drama, in the plain, direct way he had, and she understood that what he was telling her was formative, was the root system of the particular kind of steadiness he carried. She told him about her father, who had read Greek tragedy to her as a bedtime activity on the grounds that all human experience was prefigured in those plays, and she might as well have the navigation charts. She told him about the year before her father died, when he had been sick but still sharp, and they had read Sophocles together by lamplight, and she had understood for the first time that the thing tragedy was actually teaching you was the cost of hubris, the cost of believing you were untouchable. Harlan Voss never read Sophocles, she said. No, Abraham said. Men like him never do. January brought a second letter from Marshal Briggs. The federal investigation had been formalized. A warrant had been issued for Harlan Voss on multiple counts of fraud and document forgery. His assets had been frozen pending inquiry. Two of the men who had acted as his intermediaries in the deed transfers had cooperated with authorities in exchange for reduced charges, and their testimony corroborated everything Gertrude had provided from memory. Harlan Voss had been arrested on January 14, 1880, at his Philadelphia home. The inquiry agent, Garrett Fitch, had been notified that his employer was under federal arrest and that any attempt to compel the testimony or remove the person of one Gertrude Carver, now Gertrude Redmond of Oldham County, Texas, would constitute interference with a federal investigation. Briggs also wrote, in a note at the bottom of the official letter, that he would appreciate Mrs. Redmond's willingness to provide a formal written affidavit of her testimony, which could be submitted as evidence. He added that he had found her original letter to be one of the most precise and complete accounts of financial fraud he had received in 15 years of investigative work, and that she had, in his opinion, done a service for 11 families in Pennsylvania who would now have their land rights properly restored. She read this letter sitting on the porch in January sunlight that was cold and brilliant and entirely beautiful. She read it twice. Then she sat with it in her lap and looked out at the land and felt something that she did not have an adequate word for, the specific feeling of a weight carried for so long it had become structural, so that, when it was finally lifted, you were not sure at first whether you were lighter or simply no longer whole. Abraham sat down beside her. He read the letter over her shoulder. He said nothing for a moment. Then he put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her against his side, and she let her head rest against him, and they sat together on the porch in the cold January light while the cattle lowed somewhere in the near pasture and the sky went on forever. "It is over," she said. "The worst part is over," he said. "Yes. "My mother," she said after a while, "she will learn what happened. It will not be easy for her." "No," he said, "but the truth has a way of being necessary even when it is not easy." She would write to her mother. She had already composed the letter in her mind, careful and honest and not cruel, the letter of a woman who had forgiven something even while naming it plainly. She would write it and send it, and she would not know what would come back. And she would make peace with that uncertainty, because peace with uncertainty was something she had been working on since arriving in the Texas Panhandle in an October that felt like a lifetime ago. She wrote the affidavit for Marshall Briggs. She spent 3 days on it at the kitchen table, constructing each paragraph with the care she brought to the account books, precise and complete and free of emotional decoration. Abraham read it before she sealed it. He said, "This is extraordinary," and he meant it the way he meant everything, plainly and without performance. She sent it. She received a formal acknowledgement. The investigation moved forward without her. Spring came to the Panhandle the way it came to open land everywhere. Not gently, but suddenly. In a rush of green and wind and dramatic sky that felt like the earth deciding to begin again. The grass came up green and then quickly tall, the wildflowers went wild in the draws and along the river, and the cattle that had been wintered close were led out to the pastures and moved across the green land like a slow brown river of their own. The ranch came alive. Seasonal workers arrived. The days lengthened. The work expanded to fill them. And Gertrude Redmond, who had come west in October with a borrowed coat and a forged letter, and 3 years of a hidden past pressing on her like weather, found that she had become something she had not known to want because she had not known it was possible. She had become a person at home in the world. She learned more of the land. She rode Jessamine with a confidence that had ceased to require instruction and had become its own conversation. She learned to read the sky for weather, the way the clouds banked in the northwest before a norther, the quality of the light before a thunderstorm, the specific stillness that preceded hail. She learned the names of the grasses and the wildflowers from Domingo, adding to her Spanish vocabulary with a pleasure that was partly linguistic and partly the pleasure of a thing Harlan Voss could never have taken from her, a body of knowledge that was simply hers. She and Alara Garfield became genuine friends, the kind of friendship that develops between women who respect each other's competence and have no interest in performance. They rode together on Tuesdays, ostensibly to discuss the shared water rights on the draw between their properties, in practice to talk about everything, about books and the territory's politics, and the particular challenges of running things in a place where the rules were still being decided. Josephine Catt came to dinner on Sunday evenings and brought things she had cooked, dishes with influences from her New Mexican upbringing, and she and Gertrude learned to cook together with a collaborative joy that filled the kitchen with warmth and excellent smells and 3 languages operating simultaneously. One Sunday evening, after Josephine had gone home and Abraham was at the table reading, Gertrude sat down across from him and said, "I think I would like to start a school." He looked up. "Tascosa has no school," she said. "There are children on 5 properties within riding distance of this ranch whose parents brought them west with the intention of educating them and have no resources to do it. My father was a school teacher. I have his books, most of them. I have a good room in this house that is underused in the afternoons." Abraham looked at her steadily. "How many children?" I counted 11 in conversation with Alara and Josephine, ranging from 6 to 14. "And their parents have agreed." "Everyone I have mentioned it to," she said. "The question of whether the school happens depends entirely on whether the teacher is available and willing." He was quiet for a moment in that measuring way, and she could see him thinking it through, the logistics of it, the adjustment to the household rhythm, the implications. "It would change things," he said, "having children here several afternoons a week." "Yes," she said. "Is that a difficulty?" He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. "No," he said. "I think I could adapt." She started the school in April in the large front room on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. 11 children arrived on the first day in varying states of scrubbed cleanliness and nervous energy, shepherded by parents who stayed for the first hour to satisfy themselves that this was a real educational undertaking and not some eccentric project. Gertrude stood at the front of the room, in front of the chalkboard Abraham had built with 3 days' concentrated carpentry work, and attached to the wall with the careful precision he brought to any physical task, and she looked at 11 faces looking back at her, and she felt her father in the room with her, not as grief but as company. She had them read aloud, and she listened for where each one was. She had them count and calculate, and she made notes on what each one needed. She assigned 3 different levels of work, and managed all 3 simultaneously with a focused energy that left her tired and thoroughly pleased at the end of each session. Abraham would appear in the kitchen doorway at the end of sessions, and the children would fall over themselves greeting him, because he had the quality with children that some people with natural authority possess, the quality of taking them seriously without condescension. He learned their names immediately. He answered their questions about the ranch with the same directness he brought to adult conversations. On a Thursday afternoon in May, she looked up from helping a 10-year-old named Bertie Garfield with long division to find Abraham standing in the doorway watching her, and the expression on his face was the open, unguarded one she had first seen on the day of the horse run, the one he occasionally forgot to fold back. She held his gaze for a moment across the room full of working children, and something passed between them that was a whole conversation condensed into 3 seconds of shared looking. She wrote to her mother in April. The letter took 4 drafts. She kept the final version plain-spoken and honest and specific, naming what Harlan Voss had done and what she had seen and why she had run and what had happened since. She named Abraham. She described the ranch and the school and the life she had built, not as evidence of something proven but simply as facts, the facts of a life that was real and solid and hers. She sealed it. She sent it. A letter came back in June. Her mother's handwriting was smaller than she remembered, tighter, the handwriting of a woman who had been making herself smaller for years. The letter said that Harlan Voss had been formally charged and that the trial was expected in the fall. It said that she had been wrong to disbelieve Gertrude, and these 5 words were the most expensive words in the letter, the words that clearly cost her mother more than she could say. It said that she hoped Gertrude was well. It said she hoped very much to see her daughter again someday. Gertrude read this letter at the kitchen table with Abraham's hand on her shoulder, standing behind her because he had come in from outside when he saw her face. She cried. Briefly and efficiently and without shame, because there had been a time when she would have managed her crying with shame, and that time was over now. She wants to see you, Abraham said. I know. When the trial is done, he said. When it is fully settled, we could go east if you wanted. She looked up at him. You would come east with me. Where else would I be? He said simply. She covered his hand with hers. In June, Gertrude realized she was expecting. She had suspected it for 2 weeks before she was certain, and she sat with the certainty for another 3 days before telling Abraham, not because she was afraid of his response, but because she wanted to understand her own feelings fully before she shared them, and her feelings were complex and layered and brilliant in the way of large things. She told him on a Sunday morning, before the day had fully started, in the warm, early light of their bedroom with the sound of the land coming through the window. He was very still for a moment. Then he turned to her and took her face in both his hands and looked at her with an expression that was the most open and undone she had ever seen on him, every careful layer gone, just a man staggered by something he had hoped for without daring to name it. Gertrude, he said. I know, she said. He held her for a long time. Later, at breakfast, he attempted to suggest that perhaps she should slow down on the writing. She looked at him with an expression that was patient and implacable. He revised the suggestion to an inquiry about whether she had any preference regarding the morning rides. She said she preferred the same rides she had been taking, and that Jessamine was a gentle horse, and that she would be sensible about it. He nodded with the expression of a man accepting a negotiated outcome. Domingo found out before the end of the day, because Domingo always found out. He appeared at the kitchen door with a look of such comprehensive satisfaction that Gertrude burst out laughing, and Abraham told him he was never going to hear the end of being right about something. "I did not say anything," Domingo said serenely. "You have never needed to," Abraham said. The summer was warm and long and extraordinarily beautiful in the way of things that are heightened by knowing they are temporary. She knew, in the way you know things that are felt rather than calculated, that this was a particular summer, a summer that was the fullness of something that had been building since October, and she lived each day of it with a deliberate attentiveness. She taught through June and most of July. She visited Alara and Josephine. She rode Jessamine in the mornings with decreasing range as the months progressed. She worked the account books and negotiated a better price for winter feed, and organized the autumn stock preparations with a thoroughness that Cutter told Abraham was the most organized he had seen the place in 6 years. And coming from Cutter, this was high praise delivered in approximately 7 words. Abraham built things. He built a second bedroom. He built a cradle with a particular care and precision that she watched from the doorway when he did not know she was watching, and which made her feel things that were too large and too warm for any words she had available. He built a shelf for the books she had accumulated, her father's books and the books she had bought in Tascosa, and the books that had come in the supply wagon from Amarillo when she had written to the bookshop there. The shelf ran the entire length of the study wall, and when it was full it looked, Abraham said, like a very small library had wandered in from somewhere and decided to stay. She was reading at the desk one September afternoon when Pete knocked on the door frame and told her there was a rider coming in on the South Road. The particular phrasing of his knock and his tone, careful and deliberate, told her it was something he felt he should report. She came out onto the porch. The rider was a woman. She was perhaps 50, riding a good horse, and she was sitting it the way city women sat horses, technically correct but not easy, and as she came closer Gertrude's heart performed a complicated maneuver. It was her mother. She did not know, until she was already down the porch steps and moving across the yard, that she had decided to move. She did not remember descending the steps. She was simply moving and her mother was dismounting, and then they were standing 2 feet apart in the yard, and her mother looked smaller than she remembered, genuinely smaller, as if 3 years of a particular kind of life had compressed her. "Gertrude," her mother said. "Mother," she said, "the trial concluded in August," her mother said, as if establishing that the practical reason for the visit was in order before anything emotional could be permitted. "Harlan was convicted on all 7 counts. He will not be free for a very long time." "I know," Gertrude said. "Briggs wrote. I wanted to come." Her mother looked at her with eyes that were doing a great deal of work behind their composure. "I wanted to see that you were—" She stopped. Gertrude stepped forward. She opened her arms. Her mother, after a moment that cost her something visible, came into them. They held each other in the yard, in the September sunlight, with the land going on in all directions and the horses making their usual quiet sounds and the enormous sky above them doing nothing dramatic for once, just being present. Abraham came out of the barn. He assessed the situation with his usual quiet speed. He went into the house. By the time Gertrude had brought her mother inside, there was tea, and he had managed to produce it with a tact and invisibility that she would tell him later was one of the most specifically appreciated things he had done. Her mother stayed a week. It was not an easy week in the sense of being simple or smooth. It was the kind of week that required honesty and sometimes the particular discomfort of honesty, the sitting with things that could not be fixed by being named but could be held more truthfully between 2 people who had agreed to stop pretending. There were conversations at the kitchen table. There were walks in the morning before the heat. On the 3rd day her mother sat down across from Abraham and looked at him for a long moment and said, "You kept her." "Yes," he said. "When you knew the truth." "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her with that steady, dark attention. "Because she was worth keeping," he said, "and because the truth she carried was not a problem with her. It was a problem in the world that she had been asked to carry alone." Gertrude's mother looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Gertrude. "Your father," she said, "would have liked him." Gertrude's throat tightened. She nodded once because she trusted herself to nod but not to speak. "He is right," her mother said, with the precision of someone correcting a calculation they had held wrong for too long. "I was wrong to disbelieve you. I was wrong to let him turn you into a problem to be managed. I have no adequate word for it except wrong." "I know," Gertrude said. "I know you know." Her mother reached across the table and took her hand. In the evenings of that week, her mother sat in the front room where the school met and ran her hand across the spines of the books on the shelf Abraham had built, and she asked Gertrude about the school with a focused interest that was the particular interest of a person who had once loved a school teacher and understood what teaching cost and gave. On the last evening, sitting by the lamp, her mother said quietly, "You are happy." "Yes," Gertrude said, "I am." "It is not the kind of happy I would have imagined for you when you were young," her mother said. "I imagined something more contained, more conventional." "The conventional life did not go well," Gertrude said dryly. Her mother smiled. It was a smile that held sadness and relief simultaneously, the complicated smile of a woman reckoning with the distance between what she had planned and what had actually happened and finding, against her expectations, that the actual was not worse than the plan. Her mother went home in October, on the stage to Amarillo and then the train east. They embraced in the yard before the stage. Her mother said she would come again in the spring if she was welcome. "You are always welcome," Gertrude said. She watched the stage go south. Abraham stood beside her. "She is a good woman," he said, "who made a terrible mistake." "Yes," Gertrude said, "that is exactly what she is." He took her hand. They stood in the yard until the stage was gone. A letter came from Alara Garfield that same week, inviting Gertrude to a gathering of women ranchers from the surrounding county to discuss the possibility of establishing a lending library in Tascosa. The idea was Gertrude's own, seeded in a conversation 2 months earlier, and the fact that Alara had taken it and organized it filled her with a specific warm pride that was different from personal pride, was the pride of watching an idea move beyond yourself. She went to the meeting. There were 9 women from ranches across the county, and they sat in Alara's front room and drank coffee and argued productively about logistics and funding, and the question of whether the school she had started in the Redmond ranch house could be expanded into a proper community institution. She came home from the meeting with 3 pages of notes and an energy that had her at the desk until late in the evening. Abraham brought her tea. She told him about the meeting. He listened. "A library," he said. "And eventually a proper school building," she said, "with more than one room. Alara has spoken to the county commissioner about land. Who would teach? I would, to start with. And I have written to 2 young women in Amarillo who have normal school training and who might be interested in a permanent position once there is a permanent position to offer." He looked at her with that full, warm, open expression. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I'm merely noting that you came to this territory with a borrowed coat and a forged letter and you are building a library." She laughed. "When you put it that way." "When anyone puts it any way," he said. Their son was born in February of 1881. The birth was attended by a midwife from Tascosa named Mrs. Hanover, a formidable and capable woman who moved through the proceedings with a calm efficiency that Gertrude deeply respected. Abraham was present in a way that was perhaps unusual by the conventions of the time, because Gertrude had made it clear she wanted him there, and because Abraham's particular relationship with convention was, like his relationship with most things, pragmatic rather than reflexive. He held her hand. The child was born healthy and loud, announcing himself with a vigor that Mrs. Hanover said she had not heard equaled in recent memory. He was dark-haired like his father, with eyes that were currently the indeterminate blue of newborns and which would eventually settle into a deep brown. "A name," Abraham said. when the room had settled and Mrs. Hanover had gone to the kitchen, and the three of them were quiet together in the warm lamplight. "I thought," Gertrude said, holding this entirely new person with a carefulness that was both instinctive and terrified, "about my father. His name was Clarence." Abraham considered this. "Clarence Redmond," he said. "Yes." He looked at their son. "That is a very good name." She looked up at him. He was looking at the baby with an expression of such staggered, complete, unhidden tenderness that she had to look away for a moment because it was almost too much. The fullness of it, the utter completeness of this moment that had been assembled, piece by piece, from the ruins of everything she had run from. They named him Clarence Redmond. They called him Clary in the first weeks, because it was the name her father had been called by her mother, and calling their son by it felt like a kind of reunion. Spring came again. The library project moved forward. Ilara's conversations with the county commissioner bore fruit. A small lot was designated in Tascosa for a community building that would house both the library and a proper school. Donations of lumber and labor came from ranching families across the county. The work began in April. Gertrude was at the building site every Wednesday, Clary on her back in the cradle board that Domingo's wife Maria had made, watching the walls go up with a proprietary satisfaction that she did not bother to modulate. The two women from Amarillo, both named conveniently Mary, arrived in May to see the facility and discuss terms. One of them, Mary Beckett, a sharp and energetic 26-year-old from Tennessee, agreed to take the senior teaching position. The other, Mary Chen, whose family had come to Texas from California by way of a complicated history she told with great directness, agreed to take the junior position and to also manage the library's acquisitions. Gertrude handed the school over to them in September, with 3 days of intensive preparation and a complete set of notes on each student that covered everything from reading level to preferred learning style to the specific mathematical concept each child had been struggling with when she last worked with them. Mary Beckett read through these notes with the expression of a person receiving a gift. "You have made my job substantially easier," Mary Beckett said. "That was the intention," Gertrude said. She did not stop teaching. She moved to once a week, Friday afternoons, the advanced group, the older children who were ready for things the curriculum did not contain, reading and discussing and arguing about the world in the way her father had taught her, treating young minds as instruments worthy of real use. She wrote for the Tascosa newspaper. This had come about sideways, through a conversation with the editor, a man named William Carr who had arrived in Tascosa from Chicago in 1879 and was building a paper with more ambition than resources. She had written a letter to the editor about the land rights implications of the ongoing federal land survey process in the Panhandle. He had published it with her name on it and had subsequently invited her to write a column on local land and property matters. She wrote 6 columns before the end of the year. The columns were direct and specific and referenced real legal documents and processes, and were read with attention by people who needed to understand what was happening to the land they lived on. Abraham read each column the morning it appeared, with an expression she had come to know as pride, the particular quiet pride of a person who did not experience another person's success as anything other than simply good. Harlan Voss's trial records were published in the Philadelphia papers, and a summary appeared in the Kansas City papers, and a brief note appeared in the Amarillo paper in November 1881, referencing the role of testimony from a Texas resident in the prosecution. Gertrude read this note and felt something she had not expected, not triumph, not relief exactly, but a final settling, a last stone placed. She set the paper down. She went and found Abraham in the barn. He was replacing a broken stall board with the concentrated physical attention he brought to repair work. She stood in the doorway. He looked up. "It is fully over," she said. He set down his tools. He crossed to her. He held her. They stood in the barn doorway with the smell of horses and fresh lumber around them, and the September sunlight coming in at an angle and Clary making conversational sounds from the kitchen where Maria was watching him, and she felt the completeness of things, the way a thing that has been building for a long time feels when it finally arrives at its true form. "What do you want?" he asked her, his voice quiet against her hair. "I have it," she said. "What else?" she laughed. "More of this," she said. "More of all of this. That," he said, "is entirely achievable." By the spring of 1882, the school building in Tascosa was fully established and running with 31 students and 2 full-time teachers. The library had 300 volumes, sourced from donations and purchases, and one extraordinary windfall when an estate in Kansas City donated a complete collection of scientific and philosophical texts that filled 2 shelves and gave Mary Chen a project of cataloging that kept her happy for months. Gertrude continued her Friday afternoons and her newspaper column and the daily management of the ranch accounts and the riding of Jessamine across the open land on mornings when the sky was doing something remarkable and she needed to meet it on its own terms. Clary, at 14 months, had achieved independent locomotion and was applying it with a boldness that kept everyone in the household in a state of alert. He had his father's steady temperament and his mother's fearlessness and Domingo's complete adoration, and he was teaching himself to communicate his opinions through a combination of the few words he had assembled and an extremely expressive face. Abraham watched him with the same staggered tenderness he had shown at the birth, deepened now by daily knowledge, and Gertrude watched Abraham watching their son and felt something that was too large to name but that she had stopped needing to name because it was simply the atmosphere of her life, the thing she breathed. On a Tuesday evening in April, she and Abraham sat on the porch after supper. Clary was asleep. The hands had gone to their quarters. The sky was performing one of its epic evening shows, the kind that lasted a long time and went through colors that had no names, and the land stretched out from them in all directions, their land, their particular part of the enormous world. "I have been thinking," Gertrude said, "about my newspaper column. Carr has asked whether I would consider a weekly piece rather than monthly, on broader topics, land rights, territory governance, the water rights issues on the Canadian River draw." "Yes," Abraham said, "it would require more time at the desk." "You can have more time at the desk." She looked at him. "You are not going to ask whether it will interfere with the household management." "No," he said. "Because it will not, and because even if it created some interference, that would be a manageable trade-off for work that matters." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me." "When I boarded the stage in Kansas City," she said, "I was not brave. I want to correct the narrative. I was terrified. I was a woman with a borrowed coat and a forged letter going to a place she had never been to meet a person she did not know, and the reason she was doing it was not courage. It was that the alternative felt worse." Abraham was listening with his full attention. "I have been treated since arriving here as though I did something brave," she continued. "By you, by Domingo, by the women I have come to know here. And I want to say that what felt like bravery from outside was, from inside, mostly desperation. I want to be honest about that." He looked at her for a moment. "Gertrude," he said, "desperation acted on is courage. There is no form of bravery that does not contain fear. I do not know where you developed the idea that they are separate things." She thought about this. "My father used to say something similar," she said, "about the people in Sophocles. He said the ones we call tragic heroes are only called that because they acted on their convictions in the face of enormous risk. That everyone who does not do that simply gets called ordinary." "Your father," Abraham said, "was a very wise man." "He was," she said. "You would have liked each other." "I know I would have." They sat for a while longer as the sky went from its unnamed colors down through deep blue and into the first stars. The stars that over the plains came out earlier and more completely than anywhere else, as if the sky here was less obstructed. "Abraham," she said, "yes, I think we are going to have another baby." He was very still for a moment. Then he turned to her in the dark and she could feel his smile even before her eyes adjusted well enough to see it. "When?" he said. "September, I think." "I am not yet certain. He reached for her hand in the dark and held it. "A brother for Clary," he said, "or a sister." "Either would be welcome," she said. "Yes," he said. "Either would be very welcome." The summer that followed was full of the particular combination of work and warmth and rich daily life that the ranch had come to mean. The land was good that year. The cattle drive in the late summer went well. The school in Tascosa expanded to include a fourth student cohort and began seeking funds for a second building. Gertrude wrote her weekly column and was read and argued with and quoted and written letters about. The letters both approving and outraged in the way that writing which names real things tends to produce. She handled the outraged letters with a direct courtesy that diffused most of them. She handled the approving letters with a straightforward gratitude. Her mother came in July. She stayed 2 weeks. She held Clary with a tenderness that was the tenderness of a woman making restitution to herself as much as to anyone, and she sat on the porch with Gertrude in the evenings, and they talked about Gertrude's father. The first time they had been able to talk about him in years, freely and with the warmth of shared memory, without the shadow of things that had stood between them. On her last evening, her mother held Gertrude's face in her hands and said, "You are the best thing I have done in this life." Gertrude covered her mother's hands with her own. "You are going to be a grandmother again," she said. Her mother's eyes filled with tears and she laughed at the same time, which was her mother's particular response to good news, a laugh and tears simultaneously, and Gertrude recognized it as her own response to certain things and filed this as one of the unexpected gifts of reconciliation. The second child arrived in late September, a boy again. He arrived with the same vocal enthusiasm as his brother, which Mrs. Hanover said was clearly a family characteristic. Abraham held him first, because Gertrude had held Clary first and she had suggested they alternate. He held him with that complete and staggered tenderness, and above the baby's head he looked at Gertrude with eyes that were more open than she had ever seen eyes. "Samuel," he said, "I have always thought Samuel was a very good name." She had thought about this name too, had thought about it in the way of people who have been carrying something and are ready to set it down with grace. Samuel had been her father's middle name. "Samuel Clarence Redmond," she said, "if you agree." "I agree completely." Clary, brought in to meet his brother by Domingo, regarded the new baby with the solemn assessment of a nearly 2-year-old confronting competition, then appeared to conclude that the competition was acceptable, and patted the baby's head with an enormous gentle hand. The days that followed had the quality of things fully arrived at, the quality of completion that is not an ending but a fullness, the difference between a circle closed and a story finished. In October of 1882, exactly 3 years after Gertrude Carver had stepped off a stage in Tascosa with a borrowed coat and a forged letter, and her heart hammering, and her whole life suspended on the outcome of a lie she had been desperate enough to try. She sat on the porch of the Redmond ranch house in the last afternoon light with Samuel asleep in the cradle beside her, and Clary running between the porch posts with a wooden horse Domingo had made him, and the sound of Abraham working in the barn, a steady rhythmic presence, and the land going on in all its golden October beauty, and the sky above it enormous and brilliant and entirely free. She thought about the woman who had arrived here 3 years ago. She thought about the borrowed coat long since gone. She thought about the forged letter long since burned. She thought about Harlan Voss in his Philadelphia prison, and the 11 families in Pennsylvania who had their land rights back, and the federal warrant with her real name on it that had said not troubled but essential witness, and the library in Tascosa with 300 volumes, and the school with 31 children, and the newspaper column with her real name at the top. Gertrude Redmond, formerly Carver, born Philadelphia, 1854. Arrived Texas, 1879, with nothing but a borrowed coat and a set of memorized numbers and a ferocious determination to survive. She heard Abraham's boots on the porch boards. She felt him settle into the chair beside her without needing to look up. She felt his presence the way you feel weather, the way you feel home. "Good day," he asked, An extraordinary one, she said. Ordinary and extraordinary. He reached across and took her hand, the way he had been taking her hand for 3 years now, with the same deliberate ease of a man who had decided to hold something and was not going to need reminding. "Tell me," he said, and she did. She told him about the morning ride and the quality of the light on the grass. She told him about the letter from Mary Beckett about the school's expansion. She told him about the paragraph she had written and then rewritten for her column about the water rights survey. She told him about Clary's conversation with the barn cat, which had been one-sided but extremely detailed. She told him about Samuel's face when he slept, which was the most complete piece she had ever seen on any face. He listened with his whole attention, the way he always listened. The sun went down behind the escarpment to the west, and the light went through its impossible colors, and the stars came out, the Texas stars that were too many and too bright for any sky that lacked the nerve, and the land around them was dark and enormous and entirely theirs. "I love you," she said, simply because it had never needed ornament between them. "I love you," he said, simply because he was a man who spent words carefully, and this one he spent freely and often. They sat on their porch in the dark of a Texas October and held hands, and let the night come in around them, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more was needed. Because they were home. They were both of them entirely and completely home, and all the dark past and the borrowed coats and the forged letters and the hidden motives and the forced choices and the ultimate sacrifices had led, by roads no one would have drawn on a map, to exactly this. To this porch. This land. This hand in the dark. And they would have, Gertrude knew, as certainly as she had ever known anything, all the mornings that followed. Samuel would grow up and become a man who rode horses with his father's ease and read books with his mother's hunger and laughed at the world with a volume that could be heard from across a pasture. Clary would be tall, taller than Abraham, and would eventually become a man who built things with the careful precision of a person who had watched his father build a cradle and a bookshelf and understood the importance of foundations. The library would grow. The school would grow. The column would grow and eventually be reprinted in the Amarillo paper, and then in a paper in San Antonio, and the woman who had written it under her real name would become, in the territory, simply the kind of person you referenced when you needed to understand how things worked. Abraham would run his land for another 40 years, with Gertrude beside him, and the land would be good to them because they were good to it, and the hands would come and go, and some of them would stay forever, and all of them would know the name of the woman who had arrived in October with a borrowed coat, and had made this place what it became. And on evenings when the sky was performing and the stars were coming in, and the sound of the land was the only music required, they would sit on this porch and hold hands and be exactly, precisely, completely what they were. Gertrude and Abraham Redmond, who had found each other by the most improbable road and had kept each other anyway, which was the only keeping that mattered, the keeping you chose with full knowledge of the truth. The keeping that said, "I know everything and I am staying." The keeping that was not circumstance or desperation or borrowed names, but just this, just love, just the extraordinary ordinary fact of two people deciding that this was the life. This was the person. This was home. The stars came out over the Texas Panhandle in their thousands. The wind moved through the grass with its old patient sound. The horses shifted in their barn. The children slept. And Gertrude Redmond, who had come west with a borrowed coat and a forged letter, held her husband's hand in the dark and was at last, completely found.